slowly. All right, cool. Well, let's get started then. So I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today. This is Kurt Gray, that is going to give a talk about machine morality. And Kurt is an associate professor at UNC in the Department of Psychology, and he studies things like moralities and beliefs and how we can make sense of others and how we can make sense of AI systems as humans. And I first heard about Kurt's research when Jenny and I were doing some Googling around to see how people perceive like moral AI systems. And it turns out that Kurt has done a lot of research on this topic. So that was awesome to find. And I think it's really exciting that we're in this sort of area of this era of AI where it's just as important to study the kind of social psychology of humans and how humans interact with AI as it is to study like the AI themselves. Especially in light of like the whole stupid, is Google's language model sentient debate that's been happening recently. And so I should note that Kurt has also done some really exciting other things that are not necessarily related to AI. Particularly, I read one of his PNAS papers about how it's more effective to bridge political divides through sharing experiences rather than sharing facts. So that's really exciting, especially in this climate, the current political climate that we're in. And I don't know if you read his bio, but he's also won numerous awards and had his research covered in high-profile places like the New York Times and The Economist and things like that. But enough rambling. Please take it away, Kurt.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all. And as I mentioned, happy to take any questions as we go. And Google Meet's a little different for me, and like you all are over here. So if I like look this way, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because that's where your faces are. All right. Send the cat off. All right, here we go. So as Martin mentioned, right, a lot of times when we think about AI, we think about the technical challenges about making more sophisticated systems. But kind of underlying the advance of AI is really a bunch of ethical questions, especially as how people make sense of the morality of machines. And so, right, you can look at all sorts of places. You can look at self-driving cars, where people have often looked for ethical questions about AI. And so here's an example of a self-driving car hitting a bicyclist, one of the first fatalities of one of these self-driving cars. And so this is the write-up of the story, right? A woman was struck and killed on Sunday by an autonomous car operated by Uber in Arizona. So this is the first pedestrian death associated with self-driving technology, obviously cold comfort to the person who was hit. And the car had a special sensor system, and it was in autonomous mode when it hit Elaine Hertzberg 10 p.m. on Sunday. And so what we asked people in this case, just like pre-response, like who's responsible? Who's responsible for this accident? Is it Uber? Is it the pedestrian? Is it the driver, or is it the car? Right? And a quarter of people said it was the car's fault, right? And I think if you're developing AI, you don't think it's like the car has kind of like moral responsibility in this way, but lay people definitely see the car as having some kind of responsibility for what happens, some sense of being a moral agent. And so you can look at kind of other examples too. So Russia is developing a set of autonomous tanks, and they're able to kind of like figure out targeting and even potentially firing on their own. So, thank goodness they're not yet operational, but it's still something in the works, right? Something that AI is involved with. And so the question is, well, how do we make sense of machine morality in general? And I know like pundits and academics often think about like the moral implications of AI. But really what I've studied is how people think about and respond to machines making moral decisions, right? As machines are kind of like in these moral situations, how do people make sense of that? And so obviously, because I'm a psychologist, I take a psychological perspective. Of course, there's lots of other perspectives that you're probably familiar with, but I'm going to focus mostly on psychology. But if there's any kind of questions that connect with anything else, I'm happy to discuss that. So it's a big, woolly, interdisciplinary question. All right. And so today, we talked a little bit about background, talk a little bit more. First, we'll talk about whether people think that AI should even make moral decisions. And if they do, well, how should they make moral decisions? And finally, what happens if they make the wrong decision? What happens if they're biased? And what do people do in that case? All right. So we'll start with a little bit of background. And so this is some kind of like general psychology work. I'm going to run roughshod over, like decades of research. But usually when we think about moral judgment, we think about an observer who is judging a particular agent who did a particular act or action. And when we approach, the observer brings with them a set of kind of assumptions or cultural assumptions. I think, Martin, you guys study this a little bit with moral foundations theory. That's really just a kind of like update, I think, of Schwartz's values, right? Or, people have different developmental stages of morality, Kohlberg. But those are basically like theories for how people in general make moral decisions. And they often judge various characteristics of the act or the action, right? Does it cause harm? Is it a fair act? Does it follow the kind of norms of the culture? And I think those perspectives are both interesting and important. But the stuff that I've focused on more is kind of how people make sense of the particular agent doing the act. In particular, how people understand their kind of mind when they're making it. So in the law, you've got things like mens rea, right? Does someone have a guilty mind when they're doing it? Do they intend it? Are they motivated to do it? Things like that. And so I think it's important to understand the kind of like minds of others when we're making judgments about people, but also about machines, AI and robots. And so the kind of perspective I take in the talk is emphasizing the kind of like mental traits and states that people perceive in robots. And so I think the mind of the robot is actually key to understanding machine morality. But here's the thing, right? Like, what is the mind of a machine? If you're someone who actually makes AI, you may have a very specific view, but most of the time, when people interact with machines, they're left to perceive the mind of machines, right? So some people have like those little Aibo dogs, those Sony, right? And they think of them like as like a real pet, right? Something that like they connect with emotionally, and the dog like really has feelings. Or if you think way back in the day, it was like Tamagotchis, right? Like, oh, it's like hungry and it's a thing. Versus, other robots like the robotic arms on a factory floor. Maybe people don't perceive a rich mind until they're in a commercial, like this GM commercial where the robot dropped a bolt and then it committed suicide off the bridge, and then people called in and said, "Isn't this super offensive? Like, this machine commits suicide. It's so sad." But you're like, it's just a robotic arm, right? So people see different kinds of minds in machines, and so the key, and this is the Turing test, obviously, right, where people are left to kind of like perceive: is it a human? Is it a machine? And so people are left to perceive the minds of others. And that ambiguity, I think, is really important when it comes to making sense of machines, because machines are very ambiguous in terms of their mind. All right. Are we good on this assumption? Any questions before I go about the kind of perceived nature of minds? Because that's pretty important.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a question about the very first slide about Uber. It said more than 50% of people blamed the driver, but there was no driver. So did the participants understand the question, or did I misunderstand something?
Well, there's usually a driver sitting next to it, isn't there? Like when the Uber runs it, like there's some person with a laptop next to the
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay. So not fully autonomous, but it said there was also no passenger. So I guess this is the driver who was not driving.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And like, especially in these kind of like hybrid arrangements, right? How do you? I think he was on a laptop and he didn't check. He like looked at something, and by the time he looked up, it was too late to change the course of the car. So,
okay, I see.
But it is a great point that people generally, right, look for a human agent to blame, but in this case, they kind of even saw the car, even though there's someone in the car. So, but good question.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So should machines make moral judgments? All right. And so in this first study, we basically wanted to look at, do people think it's even appropriate for machines to make these kind of judgments, right? To make these calls about, whether to swerve and hit someone, right? Any kind of moral scenario. So we ask about driverless cars or autonomous vehicles, right? We ask people to imagine that someday in the near future, this was done before that Uber crash, someday in the near future, right? Cars can make autonomous decisions, and should they make these decisions about whose life to save if it comes to it. There we go. So that's what we ask, right? These decisions can affect people in the car as well as pedestrians and people in other cars. And so we gave them two conditions: a human condition, which is just like a normal car, right? People make the decision, or a machine condition where there's an autonomous computer making the decisions, right? It's just an autonomous car. And then we asked them questions about the permissibility of these decisions. So whether it's appropriate for a computer to make these decisions or a human, whether it's okay, right? Whether they should be making these decisions or whether they should be forbidden. Right? So these are just collapsed together to make a scale, right? Which is something psychologists care a lot about, the kind of reliability of these measurement scales. And so what we found is that there's a pretty big difference between machines and humans for the permissibility of making these decisions. People think it's fine for a human to make these decisions for the most part, but they're less keen on machines making these decisions. And so we tested this idea with a lot of other examples. So parole decisions are often made by a panel of humans. There's the parole board from Nevada. And we asked, well, could machines make this decision? And certainly AI has been used to inform parole decisions in other states. We asked about medical decision-making, so about, let's say, patient triaging, patient outcomes, like matters of life or death. Should machines be able to make decisions about that? And drones, right? Should machines be able to make the life or death decisions about, whether a drone, a predator drone or something like that, can fire on a target? And across all these cases, cars, paroles, making decisions about medical surgery, and drones, right? You find again and again, people are not down with machines making these decisions in general. They don't want them to make these decisions. Yeah. Is there a question? No. Okay. And why not? Well, I think it comes back again to the kind of like mind of a machine, right? To how we make sense of the mind of machines. And so I've done a bunch of work on mind perception in general, so how people make sense of the minds of other people and machines. And there's kind of two perspectives on what kind of mind you need to be a legitimate moral decision maker. Kant on the right, with the big forehead spot. It's like a funny portrait that someone wants to, right? Like, make me a portrait where, like, from above with light on my head. So Kant says you only need reason. You just need like the capacity for thinking to be a moral agent. And Hume on the right says, well, I think you need kind of reason, but you also need like sentiment. You need passion. You need feeling, right? So there's kind of like this thinking or thinking and feeling, and like, what do you really need? And most people put kind of like thinking in AI, right? We want AI to like process things efficiently, and usually less concerned about the feeling aspect. Although of course there are social robots that are made to kind of emote. And so ages ago, we published this paper on mind perception, and we basically found that people perceive mind along these two broad dimensions. One which you call agency, which is people perceive someone to have the ability to think and do, that's thinking, and one we call experience, which is the ability to feel and sense. And so this is the graph that we published in 2007 in Science. And basically, thinking and feeling are these kind of like orthogonal dimensions. And you can see at the top right here are humans. We basically perceive the average human adult to think and feel. And then you'll notice robots are down here. So perceived to have less agency, so less capacity to think and plan and act rationally, but a lot less experience, right? So even if you think that robots can remember things and like do math and be kind of efficient at calculations, people don't think that they can think and feel. And so what we want to do is look at the kind of like medical context and see whether these kind of different perceptions of mind, robots as being less able to feel and think compared with humans, could help explain this unacceptability of robots making moral decisions. Right. Okay, so we looked at the medical context. And we told participants a story about a kid who'd been hurt. His name's Jason. He's been hurt in an accident, and if nothing's done, he'll be paralyzed. But there's a surgery that can be done, and it's risky. So there's some small chance that he could die, but he could also regain function. And so the participants read that either a human made the decision of whether to perform the surgery, or an AI system made the decision whether to perform the surgery. And so the surgery in this study failed, and Jason died. And then we wanted to know how permissible was it for a human or machine to make this decision. Okay. And we also measured the mind of the robot. So how much agency does the machine or human have? So the capacity to like plan and remember and think and experience is the capacity for feeling different emotions. Measured here. There we go. Can communicate, is able to think, can plan, and can experience fear, happiness, and is sensitive to pain. So, right, the capacity to think and do, and the capacity to sense and feel. And so what we found is there's big differences, replicating our past work in science, on the perceived ability to have agency and experience between the human and the machine. And these perceptions of mind mediated the condition difference on human versus machine on permissibility. So I don't know if this kind of mediation diagram is familiar or not, but basically it argues, right, that the difference in permissibility of a human versus a machine making a life and death medical decision is explained by the fact that humans are seen to have more agency and more experience than a machine. Yeah, so it kind of like explains that difference we revealed. And so why did this happen? Well, I think it goes back to kind of Hume's argument that we expect moral decision makers can both think and feel, right? You want a doctor who not just comes in there, you know, like the Terminator basically, and being like, this is the best course of action. You want a doctor to care, right? And we know that even patient outcomes are in a large part dictated on how much you think the doctor cares about you, right? Like that's what we expect in moral decisions, right? Someone who feels kind of compassion and care. And so in that study, right, Jason died, and we ran other studies where, you know, Jason lives, or it's not clear what happens to Jason, and we replicate the effects. And we wanted to look at kind of like, well, what happens if people know that there's clear benefits for having an AI system in medicine, right? Because once you get them, they're cheaper, right? You don't have to pay a doctor, let's say, to make these decisions. You don't have the burnout of a doctor making the decisions. You just have an AI system. And so maybe if we highlight that, people will revise their judgments. And so in this study, we asked people to imagine that getting an AI system to make these decisions might save a lot of hospital beds, might provide additional beds for patients because it saves costs. And we asked people to imagine, well, how many beds would it take basically for you to think an AI system's okay? All right, so we say, look, a hospital needs to decide who would make these medical decisions, a doctor or health comp. We're very creative with the names of the AI systems. So health comp costs less than Dr. Jones. And so if health comp makes the decisions, the hospital could afford more beds and staff to provide more care for patients. Okay. And so then we either say, look, they cost the same, so they're, you know, indifferent, or health comp can provide the funds for one more bed or 5 beds, 10, 50, 100, 500, or 1,000, right? So like, what's the titration point in some sense? Like, when are people willing to say, fine, let's go with the machine, even though people have this like general aversion to machines making moral decisions? Well, it turns out, right, so here on the right, on the y-axis rather, sorry, left, we have a percent of people who choose Dr. Jones, and on the x-axis we have number of beds. That scale is obviously not right. It's like not scale. It's like each of the conditions there. You can kind of plot it out. And here's what you get. So even with 1,000 beds, right, you're only just less than 50% choosing Dr. Jones, right? So I think the crossover point is probably about like 100, right? But like that's a huge aversion, right? There's like you would get 100 more beds for using the system. People are like, nah, I don't want it, right? And so, well, you're like, well, maybe, yeah. And when we ask people to write, well, how come? And they say, look, human emotion, compassion, and spirit is an important part of healthcare. They explicitly say, like, we don't want machines because these are important things in healthcare, right? And if it's a human life, it should be humans making those decisions. So kind of almost like an ethnocentric kind of thing, right? Only humans get to make decisions about humans. And so, yeah, so to the answer of should machines make moral decisions, the answer is generally no. And how come? Well, because people think that machines should have minds. And I should say we do other studies where we explicitly highlight that the machines are very good at making these decisions, in some ways outperform, not just in like cost efficiency, but in terms of like accuracy, humans. And you get people to bend a little bit as well if you stack the deck, right, it's like better, it's cheaper, and all these ways, but it's still, this aversion is really, really hard to eliminate. Right, and so the qualifiers are if the machine is much better, people will flex a little bit, but it's not a ton. But one thing we found to actually kind of help with this is if you highlight the kind of, in some sense, immorality of the system making these decisions, if you highlight the threat of inequality.
Can I just ask a quick question before you move on?
Yeah, hop in.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the structure of the cases that you're using, and it just strikes me that like you're thinking about cases where like the entire action is done by the machine or a human, and then you're asking, can this entire process be outsourced to a machine? And that's like where the aversion comes from.
We didn't ask about the decision, like not the actual surgery.
Say that again. You asked about the decision.
Yeah, not the surgery though. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's my point. So like a lot of processes that AI is involved with, we're not just asking it, make this moral decision. It's involved in a very complex process where a moral situation might come up, but the main thing we're employing the AI to do is not make a moral decision, it's drive this car this way or assist with the surgery or do some other kind of complex action. And in order to do that at all, it will inevitably have to make moral choices that come up. And so I think like in a certain way, like maybe that is not only like, I don't know, maybe more realistic to how AI is being developed, but just also like that is where the benefit comes in. So the way that you manipulated benefit was like, if we can entirely outsource this process to an AI, things overall will get better. But the way benefit comes in is actually we're having an AI do this other process, and we kind of need it to make moral judgments along the way in order for it to even operate. Yeah, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so this is usually what I talk about when people ask me about like the moral machine experiment, which I'll get to, right? It's like people, the machines aren't making these decisions most of the time. They're basically just like trying to drive the car, and they don't get distracted. They don't text. That's the benefit, right? But also, I mean, it's funny if you think about your intuition, because it's almost like opposite to what people think, right? Because you're like, look, they don't just make the moral decision, they make the moral decision and do everything else. So like if you're afraid of machines making decisions, well, guess what? They're going to do everything now. They're going to make the decision and they're going to drive your car, right? Like they're going to kill pedestrians without you knowing. They're going to make the decision to kill those pedestrians and they're going to drive the car to kill them, right? So it's like a kind of a funny thing in explaining to lay people, because you're like, it's actually, they're making way more decisions than you think, right? Which I don't know if that's going to be better. My intuition is if you frame it as you have just there, I think they might actually be more averse to it. But I think if you frame it the other way of saying, well, they can provide all these benefits, like it's not texting, whatever, then it might be better. But yeah, it's a good point, and certainly interesting areas for future investigation. Yeah. All right, and so one thing we wondered is whether you could make AI seem more acceptable if you emphasize the fact that the kind of like human way of making decisions, and I love questions, so keep those questions coming as they pop out. Right, because as humans are making the decisions, they're not always equitable, right? And so these data came out at the kind of beginning of COVID. It basically found that non-white folks are way more likely to die from COVID. And there's probably lots of reasons for this, kind of systemic reasons, but one thing that flagged was that maybe the decision makers in hospitals are being biased against non-white folks. And so there's evidence, for instance, in Singapore, we ran some of these studies that a lot of the folks who are dying are kind of non-citizen workers who are like living in dorms where it's easy to spread, and they're much more likely to die. So there's clear kind of inequality along racial and economic lines when it comes to COVID. And so we wondered whether threats of inequality might increase people's preference for algorithm decision making, right? Because presumably robots are less likely to be biased by race and SES. And so in one of these studies, we ran a bunch of them. We basically highlighted racial disparities in outcomes for things like COVID, and we asked who should make triage decisions. And what we found, so on the y-axis, we've got preference for algorithm decisions. We look at kind of a control condition where we don't highlight the threat, and in the y condition, we highlight threat of inequality, and we ask Black and white participants. And so what we find is that the threat of inequality increases preferences for algorithm decision making for white participants, and especially for Black participants, right? Who are like, wow, right? Like it's not just a bad thing, but it's a bad thing kind of like affecting me and my family and my friends. And so especially for folks from kind of marginalized groups who are likely to be disparately infected by inequality, right? They're especially likely to prefer these algorithms. Okay, and so in sum for this section, generally people don't think that AI should make moral decisions, but maybe they should if it's the humans making decisions and those humans are systematically biased. Questions before we move on to if they are making decisions, how should they make it?
Just quickly, the scale of the acceptability was like around like 50% in the previous graph, right? So like they're still not like overwhelmingly accepting. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but it just increases it. Okay.
Yeah, we still find a general bias. That's right.
Okay.
So
awesome.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
In this, we see that Black participants are more likely to support algorithmic decision making, having been primed by a piece of text that says Black people may be subject to bias in this situation. But is it, having not run a study where, for example, the priming is opposite, saying some situation where white people may have a bias against them or some other group, is it possible to say confidently that this is a result of the priming and not necessarily the historic bias that Black participants have faced throughout society?
I'm not totally sure I understand. So right, we like randomly assign folks to either like not mentioning inequality or mentioning inequality. But I guess your question is, we prime both.
You primed both with this group is subject to bias in this situation, but I wonder if you were to flip, like take something that didn't have so much basis in reality, if you were to flip it and say, okay, white people are subject to, or some other racial group is subject to bias in this situation, do you think it would? I think the assumption is that it would flip, and you would say possibly white people would have more preference for algorithmic decision making versus Black people because of the priming or because of the historic lived experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would probably flip. I feel like there's not too many things out there where there's like not where the bias goes the other way. I think that the question here was in some sense more applied, in that, you know, because there is systemic bias here against Black participants in the States or kind of like poor migrant workers in Singapore, that we're just kind of like taking that kind of like pre-existing conditions and seeing if that would increase, highlighting that would increase the acceptability of AI. But I think it's a good point that we don't know, you know, we haven't kind of like pulled all the levers to this, right, and really isolated it. So it could be the fact that if we do some other kind of like manipulation of inequality, it might decouple it from people's identity. Which I think
I think if you did something like white people in Singapore, where there's less of a dichotomies but still a very large cultural difference, then you could possibly try and get something out of it. But of course, like we can't disentangle the experiment from like reality entirely.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. Okay. All right. How should they make decisions? So let's return to the self-driving car here that hit the cyclist. There's been a lot of discussion about how machines, in particular autonomous vehicles, should make decisions. So that Germans have some kind of code on it. And there's been a lot of papers out recently. So the social dilemma of autonomous vehicles, this nature of human behavior, and the kind of moral machine experiment that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, right? It's like the trolleys on steroids, right? Like the trolley problem with AVs, and like how do we make sense of these kind of dilemmas faced by autonomous vehicles? And I'm kind of with like Sydney in some sense that like how often does this really happen, right? Like we should probably focus on the technology, but I think it's important to kind of like think about this particular examples, right? So the moral machine experiment, as bazillions of people, that's not the specific end, but that's how I remember it, bazillions of people around the world to make trolley problems with AVs with slick pictures. So here we go, right? There's a self-driving car with a sudden brake failure will swerve and drive through a pedestrian crossing in the other lane. It will result in a dead dog, a homeless person, and a male athlete and a criminal. Or just like what, like you know these things, right? Like the AI is like boop boop boop, right? Like that, he's a criminal, right? That's a homeless person and a dog, or you know a dead woman and a male athlete, right? So people have to like decide what the AI is going to do, and basically if you aggregate all these things across, so you never actually ask people explicitly about these things, but if you aggregate across all these things, you can kind of like inductively reveal people's preferences for all sorts of things. So in general, right, people want to save more people than fewer. Cool, that makes sense, right? They have a general preference for inaction. You want to just keep the car going straight rather than like swerve. And then there's some other things, right? You want to protect humans over pets, the young over the elderly. You know, you want to spare the lawful over criminals. It's like jaywalking. So it's like, I don't know if they're really criminals. Maybe it depends on where you are. Spare rich people, fit people, females, and pedestrians. Yeah. So, you know, they've made a big splash. But here's the thing, like designing AI to do this contradicts all sorts of intuitions and declarations about like the equality of human life, right? And one thing they didn't ask is about race. Like imagine they're like, hey, guess what? People want these cars to spare white people over black people. People want cars to be racist, right? And I would bet you a lot of money that they would find that because people have implicit racism, right? They're implicit bias. And if you inductively reveal people's preferences, you will get preferences like that, right? People want rich people to be spared. And I bet they want their own race to be spared. So is this really the recommendation that people want to be making, right? We should save like rich white people, like good, right? That's the kind of recommendations we need for AI. And so this is inconsistent, I think, with a lot of intuitions about how we kind of want society and AI to be structured, but also inconsistent with this idea that we even want machines to be making moral decisions, right? In the first place. And I think the work that we did earlier suggests that we don't. And so I think the issue here with this experiment is in some sense methodological, but that is in a very powerful way also theoretical. And that is that participants cannot say that they don't want the machine to make a decision, right, or to treat lives equally. And so we ran this study. We got a representative sample from the UK and from the US. And we either provided people with two conditions. We asked them explicitly, who do you want to save? Who do you want to slave? And you could either have, you had to choose like rich people or poor people, right, men or women, or we allowed them to say, I don't want the AI to choose at all. I just wanted to like treat them equally and just like, well, whatever happens, happens, right? The car just keeps on driving and like, it's some sense insensitive to these social forces and factors. All right, so here's the kind of forced inequality, you know, whether AI should kill executives and doctors or homeless people. What do you choose? Turns out when people choose this, they overwhelmingly choose rich people, right? High status people. And so this is useful because we replicate their effects, right? We replicate their effects, showing that this kind of like explicit judgment, it's like much less slick and beautiful than like aggregating across all these things, right? But we get the basics. If you just ask people, rich people, poor people, people are like rich people. And so you can kind of get preferences easily without having to inductively collapse across things. But now you're saying, look, rich people, poor people, or maybe just like don't like evaluate their lives and weight them differently. All right, what happens? Well, it turns out people overwhelmingly want you to just like have a car and not be like rich people, kill poor people, turns out. We get the same thing that they find with gender. So forced to choose, people, are like chivalrous for good or for bad. But if people are allowed to say treat them equally, then people overwhelmingly say like just treat them equally. And so what this suggests is that when you're thinking about how to program self-driving cars, there are some things that are like structural features that people do agree on, right? They want AVs to save more people, and they generally want them to have inaction, right? So not swerve onto the sidewalk to kill different people than they were going to kill otherwise. But it turns out that they actually don't want AVs to be sensitive to personal features like age or gender, status or fitness or race, for instance. And so our kind of argument is that when programming these cars, it's okay to kind of like bake in kind of basic moral judgments that kind of transcend social categories. But people don't want these things to be baked in to their autonomous vehicles. Any questions about this study before we move on? Nope. Okay. Here we go. All right. So the final thing we'll talk about is what happens when AIs make the wrong moral decision in some sense. And so this really gets at the idea of kind of AI-based discrimination. So we know that people discriminate when it comes to hiring, right? So all sorts of psych studies, like if the same resume goes out with a kind of name like, John Smith or Jamal Washington, right? People are much more likely to hire John Smith than Jamal Washington just because, right? Just that name, because Jamal seems like a Black person. And so people just, right, are racist, right? They don't want to hire the Black person. And so, right, this impacts all sorts of things like career advancement and who's in the C-suite. For not just race, but with women as well, right? The glass ceiling. Women can't reach the C-suite as easily as men because systemic discrimination in hiring and advancement. The same is true with age. Okay, so there's lots of discrimination, clearly. And so the problem is humans, right? We're biased, we're sexist, we're racist, we're all sorts of ists, right? Humans are bad decision makers. And so what's the solution? Machines, right? Let's use machines. They're not intrinsically racist and sexist, and then everything is better in the world, right? Machines have better opportunity to make fair parole decisions and medical decisions and all sorts of things. But of course, right, is this true? No, right? I mean, machines, right? There's that article in Science by Sendel who argues like, look, machines are better than humans in some ways, but that kind of like what you program into it, right? Like the data that they crunch is inherently biased, and so the decisions that they make are also going to be biased, right? So, right, Amazon had a tool that didn't hire women because it like learned in some sense that the words like women's chess club were a flag to like being a less good programmer, and so it just like kicked those resumes out of the pile. Right. So likewise, parole decisions, right? Parole algorithms are used to predict recidivism rates, and they're racist, right? Because that's the kind of data that get programmed in for structural reasons. All right. And so what we wondered, though, is even if the decisions are still kind of biased, maybe people would be less outraged if algorithms made discriminatory decisions. And so you can imagine, right, like there's this harm that's caused by kind of human or algorithm, and the outcome is the same in both cases, right? Discriminatory practices, right? So women and people of color are excluded from business, whether that's a decision made by a human or an algorithm. But the motivation that people see, right, because we're perceiving minds again, right, is probably different. So people perceive motivation in other minds, right? Why did a human HR person not hire a Black person or a woman for this particular position? Well, it's because that they are sexist or racist. But why did the algorithm not hire a Black person or woman? Well, algorithms aren't racist or sexist, and so I don't know, maybe it was just programmed that way, right? But what we're wondering is whether this kind of like idea of motivation attribution changes how people react to these things. And in particular, they're less likely to get outraged. We often talk about moral outrage today as like a bad thing that's poisoning social media. But in other ways, moral outrage is like really good, right? Because if someone does something terrible, right, if someone's like racist or sexist, then like that outrage you feel is good because it makes you like, you know, write Amazon letters, right? Take to social media and say like, this is terrible, right? Like we need equity when it comes to hiring in tech. And so if an algorithm is perpetrating it, maybe people feel less outraged and they're less likely to kind of like, right, try to change the systems. And so in this study, what we wanted to look at was kind of motivation attribution for unjust hiring practices. And so we had people imagine in this study, lots of other studies around this, some kind of gender discrimination in credit limits. So we said, look, there's a human condition where a human makes a decision about credit limits, or an algorithm makes the decision. And I say this is like real, this really happens. So this is like an example that we took from real life. And so at the end of 2019, both members of a married couple applied for a credit card. Both the husband and wife shared equal ownership of their assets. And they were evaluated either by CompNet, very sophisticated AI name again, or Mr. Miller, a mid-level employee. And after evaluating their applications, CompNet or Mr. Miller gave the man a higher credit limit than the woman. That's a big difference. And so an internal audit suggests that CompNet or Mr. Miller systematically gives men more positive valuations than women. Okay, this is in general true. And so we asked people, why do you think this happened? And we took their answers. We removed the mention of the agent, so people were blind to kind of condition. The coders were blind to condition. And then we coded people's responses, just asked like, well, how much are they saying that this agent, CompNet or Mr. Miller, is sexist? Yeah. And so what we found, so it was reliable coders, and what we found is that people were much more likely to spontaneously mention kind of like being sexist when it comes to the human versus the algorithm. Makes sense because the algorithm, right, is generally perceived to have less mind than humans. And so this seems like algorithms are perceived to be less motivated by sexism, and again, might cause less moral outrage when they do something discriminatory. And so we tested this. We focused on racial discrimination in hiring, and the two conditions were either, again, a human discriminated or an algorithm discriminated against African Americans. And so we said, look, CompNet, Amazon's CompNet versus another HR person were seen to be biased when rating applicants' resume. And if there were kind of like any words that suggested race, like Black people in STEM, it kind of kicked out those resumes. And we ran a lot of different studies with a lot of different variations after review were suggested. So sometimes we talked about, HR committees in general. Sometimes we just said that the computer just screened resumes and didn't actually make the decisions. So we tried to kind of approximate actually how algorithms are used in tech hiring. And so we measured a mediator, which we thought would be an attribution of prejudice motivation, as in, do you think that CompNet is racist? There we go. And we measured moral outrage, like I'm morally outraged by these actions. And so we found an effect of like when the algorithm discriminated based on race, people were less outraged. And this was mediated by the fact that people perceived the algorithm to be less motivated towards discriminating against Black people, right? So less racist, basically. And so turns out we ran this a ton of different ways with a ton of different kind of social categories. And no matter how you slice it, it always kind of comes out, right? So whether it's AI discriminating against based on race or age or gender, we use a representative sample, you use Norwegian tech workers, comes out the same. So even if you have a knowledge of kind of how algorithms are made, it comes out. You can kind of you can expand or decrease the effect based on your description of the programmers a little bit. So people assume that the people programming these algorithms are kind of racist. And if you describe this this happening based on an algorithm that was programmed, like if a all-female company made an algorithm that was discriminating against women, people are a little less outraged, even if you like mention it, because like they ascribe kind of less racist motivation to or sexist motivation to the programmers. And so you can kind of push it around a little bit if you discuss actually who's making it. But in general, people are less outraged by algorithms being discriminatory than by people. All right. So why should we care about this? Well, one reason is because people just don't challenge discrimination when it's done by algorithms, which is a bad thing, right? Amazon or whoever can be like, sorry, it wasn't me. It was like CompNet, you know, my bad. We'll try to hire more women and folks from minority groups later, right? Like that's a bad thing for society, I'd argue. But it's also the case that I think people will kind of reinforce these stereotypes, right? Because they think that algorithms are impartial, they're not biased. And so if algorithms are making these decisions, then people think that those decisions are themselves impartial. And it makes sense then to kind of like reify those stereotypes, right? So if, let's say, AI versus humans are discriminating against immigrants in credit decisions, right? So if you're a new immigrant, you should deserve less credit. We asked about how motivated you think that either an algorithm or a human is to discriminate against new immigrants. We're confident as prejudice. And then we endorsed in general, like, how much do you think that immigrants are good at finances, right? And this is like, because you can't ask people like, are immigrants, do they not deserve credit? Like, are immigrants like bad at money or whatever, right? Because people are not likely to endorse such like kind of like bald-faced kind of like discriminatory things. But these things are like kind of like insidiously prejudice, right? You know, if it was reversed, if it was about sexism, right? You know, it's like we had a random story. We had a mortgage broker, and my wife and I sat down with it, and the mortgage broker was like, you know, ladies, and they love their Kohl's card. They love just like buying things and shopping, and sometimes they don't like think about what they're buying. My wife was like, fuck you. Like, no, I don't know about that, right? Because like it turns out I'm also good with money, right? And so there's kind of like this insidious bias about along these social categories. And if an AI makes those decisions, people think that maybe an AI isn't prejudiced, and then they're more likely to endorse it. And so that's exactly what we found, right? So if the algorithm discriminates, people are more likely to endorse that stereotype. Not huge with our measures, but you get this kind of like this direct motive or mediation, right? Where the algorithm is seen to be less prejudice, and less prejudice leads to the stereotype endorsement. So in general, if someone thinks that something else is impartial, they're more likely to think that their decisions are impartial as well. All right. So we covered, right, should people make moral decisions? Should algorithms make moral decisions? No. How should they make decisions? Well, they shouldn't, but if they do, people should be impartial, or they should like advance equity. And what if they make the wrong decision? Well, people are less likely to get outraged. Okay, so there we go. So people in general don't like AI to make moral decisions. If they do, especially with self-driving cars, then they shouldn't care about things like race and class. But if eventually they do make kind of moral decisions, and those decisions are biased, then people are, interestingly, kind of less outraged by them, right? So like people are generally outraged by the idea of AIs making decisions, but once they do make those decisions, if those decisions are biased, then they're less upset and they're more likely to endorse these stereotypes. So in general, right, I've tried to argue that when we're making sense of robots or AI, it makes sense to think about how people understand their mental capacities, their minds, and then understanding the kind of mind perception of AI is a window into their moral decision making. There we go. And that is all I've got. Thanks for listening. Thanks to all the folks who've helped with this. Thanks to NSF for funding it, and thanks to you for listening. All right.
Thanks so much. I think maybe we should use the raising hand feature on Google Meets if you have a question, and I am looking at the room too, so you can just like raise your hands in the room as well.
And should I stop sharing? Is that okay? So I can kind of.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I can stop the recording too, or do people want to? We can cut out the question part of the recording later. Yeah, Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, that was fascinating talk. Really fun to realize that humans are so inconsistent. How could they hate the idea so much and then don't blame it as much? That's just mind-boggling. I wonder about this aversion, whether there's some difference depending on their moral framework, like consequentialist versus deontologist. Do they have a different level of aversion because the number of a bad example definitely had more cost benefit, but people still didn't approve it, which makes me think maybe those people who hated it is less of a consequentialist.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think, moral psychology definitely has its roots in kind of like moral philosophy, where you like talk about kind of consequences and deontological, and I think it's probably the case that like committed utilitarians are going to be more okay with that if you make the benefits explicit. I also just don't know, speaking of like the inconsistency of people, like how much people are intrinsically dedicated to one moral philosophy or the other, right? I think it's mostly just like what's primed in the situation, what strikes them. I think they're both deontologists and utilitarians. I mostly think they're like trying to do whatever they think will like minimize the harm. I think they're kind of like rule utilitarians in a sense, right? They're just like, does it make sense to follow rules? Yeah, if they're good rules, and otherwise, like, let's save the most people, and I don't even know, right? So morality is complicated enough. Machines no one understands, and then you put machines and morality together and people just like have no idea, they're like, I don't know, like, let's make this up as we go. So it's a great question, and I think the individual differences about these things are really interesting to investigate. I'm just not sure how much they matter. I guess the moral machine kind of looked at a little bit kind of like across like regions, which is super interesting, but I think in general, I don't know how reliable people are in terms of their differences, but I think it's a great idea to look at.
I had a question too. I mean, you painted a really, detailed and broad picture of like how bleak it is to have AI systems making any kind of like, any kind of impact on people, whether it be like, subtly moral or really explicitly moral. I guess this is kind of a weird question, but like, I'm wondering like, what are some positive takeaways that we as AI people could sort of take from this in terms of how we design our systems, and some cautionary sort of points too.
Yeah, so I guess there may be like three answers. So one, is it bleak? Maybe, but also I think these things evolve, right? These intuitions evolve. So I also do a lot of work on the uncanny valley, and the uncanny, right? Like people hate humanoid robots, or at least they used to, right? So I think as they get more and more humanoid, and like video games get more human-like, and in Japan, for instance, right, you get like a way suppressed uncanny valley oftentimes, right? But like the idea of the uncanny valley was coined in Japan in the 70s. And I think it's like less likely to be found now because there's more exposure to humanoid robots in Japan than in the States. So I think as AI make more moral decisions, people will be more okay with it. They'll be influenced by the norms, in other words. So I think if you just keep at it, people will get used to it, right? People will get used to like Ubers being driven by AI. I think knowing that, like, what do you do now? Well, one thing you could do now is you could try to imbue these AI systems with mind, or with perceived mind, right? So you can imagine a computer that just spits out like, pull the plug on grandpa, like that's the efficient thing to do, or whatever, right? Like, or you could make something, more like Cynthia Brazil stuff, right? Like social robots, like, oh, the Ewok says like, let grandpa die, and he's like very cute about it and clearly like full of compassion. So I think in that case, it's probably easier to accept it, right? If you imbue AI systems with perceived experience and agency, that could help. the other suggestions from other people's work is like, there's other things you can do that I didn't touch on, like make it explainable, right? If it's kind of more transparent, then it's like less like the AI is making the kind of like decision in some sense, and more like there's a set of rules that are built in, and those rules make sense, and the AI is just like making it based on those rules. So it's like less, the machine is like a separate agent and more just like a set of even like philosophical rules that it's just like using. So we can even like make it more of a human or less of a human, but not at the kind of point in between.
Cool, thanks. Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Hand at the back.
Yeah. I was wondering, is there anything to do with how relatable it is for in case of humans, for example, like if you do a more fine-grained set of humans, like family, friends versus strangers, like when they make decisions, I'll trust my family more in terms of like making a decision for me, for example, right, more than a stranger. Similarly, like when it comes to, I think, agents or like modern machines, like the perception of like machine making a decision or like doing any sort of task is that, okay, it's not like it's not good enough, right? So how much of that would affect how much people trust like it making decisions? I think it's kind of close to the agency and experience which you mentioned, but I don't know if it's like a separate thing, like trust or like relatability too. So when it comes to even relatability, it's like I would be much more comfortable if it's a top surgeon of the country making a decision for me versus like, say, some person who is not like well qualified for that particular job or something, right? So those sort of fine-grained differences could also exist, right? So I don't know, like, what is your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the general point of like the skill of the AI matters, right? Certainly the case. And in the first set of studies I talked about, I didn't talk about that study in particular, but we did kind of manipulate, right? If you know the AI is better than the surgeon, either because it makes better decisions or, as Sydney mentioned, right, it's going to actually just do the surgery better, then people are more willing to do it, even if there's still kind of like some kind of like lasting, lingering aversion. But the question to the family, maybe you can elaborate a little more on. Is it like that people trust families to make decisions more than AI and random strangers? And if you make AI more like family, like you're...
No, what I was trying to say is that like I would trust my family to make decisions more than like a stranger, for example, because my family would know more about me and like my background and things like that. So they could like, even if it's not explicitly specified that, okay, this is my background, like they can, I trust them more, sort of a thing.
Okay.
It's the sort of thing I was trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, trust is super interesting and obviously a key criterion when it comes to like AI. I mean, I think written some stuff elsewhere in like HBR about the importance of trust with machines, and I think part of it is experience. You trust your family because they care about you, and I think and part of that is the capacity for experience. I think that they're also kind of like, trust is about vulnerability too, right? So like if you are paired with, if you're a soldier, you're paired with like an AI, and you know that the machine can be harmed, then I think you're more likely to be like, we're in this together, right? Like we could both be destroyed. But if you know the AI like can't be harmed and is totally invulnerable, then it's hard to feel like you kind of like share a fate. So I think that those considerations matter, and I think they're, as you say, they're like kind of connected to mind, not perfectly aligned with mind, but mind is certainly an important consideration. Yeah, good point.
I have a question.
Oh, just maybe, I don't know, Kurt, do you have another meeting with someone, like a one-on-one?
Maybe, I don't know.
I just want to check in on time.
Oh, yeah, Ronan's one.
Okay.
Ronan, I'm supposed to meet with Ronan?
Yeah, thanks.
Ronan, do you want leeway to still ask a question?
I have asking one later.
Okay. Sydney, is your question also quick, or is it a longer question?
It's okay. I can let him go.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again. Sorry to be the timekeeper, but thanks for everyone for joining, and thank you again, Kurt, for giving this really awesome talk. This was great. Everyone, let's thank the speaker again.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
Right.
All right, I'll just pop to Ronan.